within the agricultural sector. I am a proud member of a farm family and town still. And my favorite place remains back on the farm, although I do not necessarily have to get up with the livestock. My parents continue to do so. It is the place where most of my heart and a lot of my time is spent. The passion and drive that you will hear between Josh and I related to prevention of incidents within this sector is in part professional and in part personal, whether family, friends, as well as ourselves continue to have involvement within this sector, and the importance and value of regular conversation on how we can be sure that those individuals who are so important to us and you return home or stay on farm, which is their home, safe and well, just as they have started each and every day. Struck by incidents, as we will discuss, are one of the more common types of incidents that occur within this sector. And the true negative within the results of these incidents are how severe. Over the last decade in particular, the ministry as well as other organizations within the sector have collected data on these types of incidents. And those span from examples of children who have been struck and killed often by equipment on farm property, such as a skid steer and tractor within the year of 2022. It involves the farmers or operators of these facilities, such as those who are working on equipment and are crushed in between that piece of equipment and perhaps a wall or another piece of moving equipment. One particular example of a farmer in Ontario who was in between two tractors, and the unit that he is working on is the fixed object and the other rolled, and he was struck and crushed, died as a result. We also have examples of workers in facilities where not only the equipment moving on property, but also the material that somehow is moving, perhaps not secured, that has become the object that has struck the individual. And the results have been either severe or critical injuries, right through to fatalities. And in that last decade in particular, we have a couple of examples, whether involving bales, large round squares, or even small blocks of material, as well as smaller items on pallets or skids that have not been secured and have moved, tipped, or somehow made contact with the individuals. And as a result of that contact, those severe injuries and fatalities, through investigation, the operators of these facilities have been held accountable, which is one part of the negative result. The greater, of course, is that personal impact that we'll discuss as we go. And to do so, I will welcome Josh, our specialized consultant for machine safety and robotics, with a wealth of insight, experience, family and friends who continue to have involvement within this sector. Thanks, Josh.
Wow, Kristen, thank you. That was such a great opening to kind of set the tone for today's conversations. So welcome, everyone. My name is Josh Payne. As Kristen did an introduction here, I am a consultant here at WSPS focused on machine robotic safety. A little bit about myself. I do live in the Chatham-Kent region. Most of my friends, are farmers, and I grew up living in with family farms and spending quite a bit of time on the farm. So I do echo Kristen's sentiments there on being like favorite place to be, right? Now, having said that, what we're going to talk about today is preventing struck by hazards in the agricultural sector. Okay, we've split this into 3 modules. The first module, we're going to focus on some introductory stats and the what and the why. right? There's intention behind this presentation, as there has been a number of incidences that we continuously see across the province, with struck by being one of the leading causes of injuries within the sector. Module 2 will focus on how to manage struck by hazards in the workplace following a simple methodology that we refer to as the RACE process here at WSPS. If you've taken any of our training in the past, I'm sure you're familiar with this acronym. If you're not, that's okay. We're going to describe the process in detail. Then, in terms of Module 3, we will go through session wrap-up, discuss some resources, and have a little bit of a question period for everyone. I do encourage you throughout today's conversations, though, if you have any questions as we're going through, please feel free to put them in the chat. Between Kristen and myself, we are monitoring the chat here. Okay? So with that, we'll get into the what and the why. Okay? So when we look at struck by injuries, what these are referred to as when a worker are struck by moving machinery, objects, or materials. Okay? They continue to be one of the leading causes of injuries within the agricultural sector, both in terms of lost time injuries and non-lost time injuries. Now, if we take a step back and actually think about this, right? Because of the equipment, because of whether it's the mass, the force, the movement, generally a lot of times when we see struck by injuries, and I'm sure Kristen would echo the same, Jay is also on the line with us from WSPS listening in, is a lot of times when we see these types of injuries, the severity is very high, okay? Including things such as fatalities. Quick little story for you. In my neck of the woods, if you've ever been in the Thamesville area, one of my friend's father, this was a couple of years back, he was heading north on 21 highway. He was just before the bend going into Thamesville, where the bridge is. Co-op is on the right-hand side after you get over the bridge there. But nonetheless, he was driving in his pickup, had his four-ways on, slow moving vehicle sign on, and he was moving a tank of anhydrous at the time. Driving in a straight direction, he feels someone drive directly, loud bang, drives directly into the tank of anhydrous, driving in the same direction, and did cause an accident. And unfortunately, what ended up happening was, with the blind spot coming around, if you've ever driven on 21 highway heading toward Thamesville, it kind of S's right before the bridge there. And unfortunately, there was a female individual operating a vehicle that drove directly into the back of his anhydrous tank, and she was unfortunately killed in the situation. And a lot of times it's a good reminder for us to think about it, especially I know WSPS, we did quite a bit of campaigns across the different municipalities, different regions, specifically talking about the slow moving vehicle hazards, specifically with tractors, turning left, right? And how that adjustment of speed for individuals that may be traveling at 80, 90, 100 kilometers an hour, and how it's important for us to anticipate and ensure that, the other vehicles on the road are aware of these potential hazards. Back to the slide here, right? In preparation for this session, and anyone can do this, is you can actually go on WSIB's website and perform what we call a safety check, and you can actually look into the industry statistics for the different sectors. Now, in preparation, specifically looking at the agriculture sector, when we look at the leading causes of injuries within the agriculture rate groups, now this includes all types of agriculture, whether it's greenhouses, whether it's crop production, those types of things. Struck by was actually number one with 17% of injuries. Okay, so it's a very high number. I would say this, we're going to have some additional stats on the next few slides, but it's also been a very high ministry focus point in terms of campaigns, in terms of things that they're looking for in the workplace. When I say campaigns, formerly known as blitzes, but nonetheless, right? It's definitely something for all of us to keep our eyes on. Now, to go more deeper into these stats, when we talk about what that 17% looks like, in terms of in 2023, there was 145 lost time injuries related to struck by in the agriculture sector. In terms of from 2020 to 2023, there was almost 500, right, with 473. And as Kristen set the tone on and reviewed some of these severe statistics, there's also been 3 fatalities within the time frame of 2020 to 2023. Okay? So to kind of dive into this, I do find this next slide to be very interesting, right? Is when we look at the top lost time injuries events within the agriculture sector by age, you will see here that anything in orange is the struck by. Now, we can have some hypothesis on maybe on age playing a factor in terms of maybe younger individuals having a little bit more risky behavior. Obviously, as we age as well, that, falls seem to be a higher cause of lost time injuries based on things such as visual, in terms of recovery, our bones becoming more brittle. And on the topic of the slip, trips, and falls, I do know we have another safety connection coming up here shortly that will cover this topic in particular, but nonetheless, right? The struck by in terms of being a hazard, it's a pretty big driver of the lost time injuries within the sector. Okay. So what we're going to do is have our first poll. It's going to pop up here in a moment. So struck by injuries are the leading cause of injuries within the agriculture sector at which percentage? Was it 22, 17, or 28? Once you've answered the poll, you'll submit it and you'll actually have to close it. Okay? So I do see some responses coming in. Right off the hop. Awesome. Great job, everyone. Give it a couple more moments here. Allow everyone the opportunity to answer. And looking at the results, the most popular answer is the correct answer. So it is 17%. Okay? So the meat and potatoes of today's lesson, or not lesson, safety connection, we're going to be focused on going through this race process. Okay? So what this methodology is, it's the process to prevent injuries or illnesses. Now, we're going to talk about it in terms of the context of struck by hazards. However, this is a methodology that you can apply to any hazard in the workplace. Okay? The first step that we focus on is recognize the hazards. Okay? So we're identifying existing or potential hazards in the workplace, gathering information about that recognized hazard. Okay? So we'll talk about in the context of how this will apply to struck by hazards, but it's going around understanding where these hazards exist and gathering information if there's in terms of the different processes that these may come up in. Next, we assess that hazard. So we determine the risk level of the hazard. Now we're going to talk about the different ways to assess the hazard, but nonetheless, understanding the risk level will drive the next couple steps. From there, after we assess the hazard, we implement controls to eliminate or reduce the risks associated with the hazard. And then finally, we evaluate to check if the hazard's been eliminated or controlled to an acceptable level. One last point before we move forward here is that you'll notice that this is a closed loop system, meaning that we're constantly recognizing, assessing, controlling, evaluating hazards, and driving that continual improvement within the workplace. There's times where we put in controls, and you'll see when we get to that slide specifically towards the end, is that it's important that we take that step and we evaluate because maybe we've introduced some additional hazards, or maybe there's additional controls we can put in to minimize the risks associated with that hazard. So having the evaluation piece to me is very important. It's often one of the most common steps missed in this process. However, we'll come back to the importance of evaluating the hazard controls towards the end of this section. Okay? So, in terms of step 1 in recognizing hazards, it's important for us to recognize where struck by hazards are present in the workplace. Now, there's a ton of different ways we can do this, right? Whether it's actively through workplace inspections, analyzing each step of your job-related tasks in your workplace, discussing concerns with workers and supervisors, Okay. Observing. What do we see? What do we hear? Those types of things. Using all of our senses and reviewing workplace records in reports to look for opportunities for hazards present in the workplace. Okay. Now, sometimes taking a step back and looking for hazards can be a very, I don't want to say daunting task, but everyone's busy here. You're working on the farm, especially in the busy seasons, right? Can be very difficult. But having an active process for workers to communicate hazards, we know as part of the General Occupational Health and Safety Act, it's important we have a process in place that workers are reporting hazards to their supervisor or employer, and that the employer and supervisor are implementing reasonable controls for the protection of workers. Okay? The other note here I just want to spend a little bit time on is, for me, the incident investigation reports, such a vital tool in the process in the workplace to ensure that we are taking a step back when something happens, whether that's a near miss, whether that's an incident, to really think about how we can prevent that from happening again. Okay? Now, we don't go into too much detail on this specifically with the slide, but I'll tell you a quick little example that I went through, kind of the importance of this, right? Is that in my previous life before joining WSPS, I primarily worked in automotive manufacturing. Okay? At the beginning of the pandemic, we had bought a business unit from another manufacturer. Okay, so it came with 6-7 plants globally. Most of them were Mexico. I believe there was one in the United States, 2 in the United States, some overseas. Okay? Within the first 30 days, we had a fatality related to lockout tagout and struck by a robot. Okay? Worker went in to complete a minor maintenance and servicing task, while maintenance was completing another task further up the line. And during that time, another worker had shut the door as an individual was inside of a robotic interlocked door, okay, in robotic cell. And the reason why I talk about this in terms of like the near misses, right? The robot turned and killed the worker inside, and unfortunately, we lost 2 people that day. The individual that shut the door as well was actually the worker's son. And I can't make that up. Like it's something that, that we live with, and I never met these people. It's something that I'll always carry with me. But the biggest thing for me is when I got over there later, after the investigation or after the process happened, it took me a bit to get over there because of the pandemic. But nonetheless, a part of that is what I found was that workers still weren't locking out. And what was telling me that was very important for us to recognize, and the kind of the lesson learned I'm trying to share with people, is there was near misses that were happening probably on a daily basis, happening all the time, and it wasn't getting addressed, right? And at the end of the day, what ended up happening was the machine, because it wasn't addressed, we allowed that behavior, and ultimately it led to a fatality. Okay, Kristen, am I still with you guys? I lost my screen here.
You're good, Josh.
Okay, can you guys see the slide?
Yep.
Okay, for some reason I can't see it. Okay, so you can see it at the bottom. So the chat wise, I'm gonna have to. Can you reshare? I can't see the slide.
Absolutely. And how about I'll review the question for the moment, and perhaps Simona can start that poll, and I'll reshare in that moment. So this chat question it's a chat, not a poll. I confused myself. What are common sources of struck by hazards within the agricultural sector? So Josh and I invite you, the participants, to contribute in the chat examples of sources of struck by hazards in your facilities, and give me one moment to reshare. So while we await Josh's return, thanks so much, Jay. Common sources of struck by hazards. I alluded to some of those in the introduction, and Josh has shared some specific stories in his experiences as well. Absolutely, the equipment we have within the sector tractors commonly, and whether that is the operator of the tractor who may step off of that platform and there is a roll. It may be an individual who is on property while the tractor is moving. We shared some of those examples involving from children all of the way through to workers within this sector. And I'll broaden the term I see in the chat, and please do add to the other examples if your thoughts are elsewhere. Within that term equipment, it may not only be our mobile equipment that results in exposure to this type of hazard, but consider the processing, box making, soil machines, monorails, any of the equipment moving through the workplace that might not be mobile, such as a forklift or a tractor, can certainly present these hazards as well. Did I hear your voice, Josh?
I am back and it's working.
Okay, there we are. Back to you.
No, thank you. It's definitely great job taking over such short notice in our troubleshooting. So I do see the messages coming in the chat. Jay Livestock, great example, right? Lots of tractors and equipment. Okay. Give another moment or so for individuals to consider some additional sources, right? That might be on the farm. Okay. So we'll move forward to just some things to think about. So tractors came up by quite a bit of people here. And like quick little story here. And I will never, I remember being in elementary school, right? In small community, right? I grew up in Richtown. And someone from my school, I'll never forget it. My dad was on the fire department. I had to go to the call. There was an individual and their kids were actually a couple years younger than me, but nonetheless, their father was actually operating their tractor, and cutting next to a pond and, rolled over the tractor within the pond and got pinned underneath the, within the equipment here. I'm sorry, guys, within the equipment, and he didn't make it. And I remember my dad had to go to that call, but at the end of the day, it's also being aware of your surroundings too and the other factors that may play, based on your environment as well. Using that pond as an example, whether it's tow carts, like we're getting into things such as greenhouses, definitely, or even on the farm, right? Definitely wagons being a very common source as well. There's been a number of situations that, whether it's some family friends, whether it's in situations that we definitely came across as consultants of where wagon shifting, because they're not controlled or blocked to prevent their movement during loading and unloading procedures. So we'll talk about that when we get into the control sections. Different types of materials, vine pulling machines, scissor carts, tuggers, right? Especially when we're getting in the greenhouse sectors, thinking about some of the automated equipment and pallet wrappers. And as Jay's talked about, many of you might have livestock, right? And having those processes in place to help guide the animals and protect yourself using different types of barriers, whatnot, boards, right? To help with some of those guiding of the animals during some of those farm-related activities, okay? So after we've identified the hazards, we need to assess them, right? Now, when we talk about hazard assessment, right, it's the process of evaluating an identified workplace hazard to determine the extent and the severity of the hazard. I like to think about safety in terms of there's risk in everything that we do, right? Whether that's walking in your driveway, walking on the farm, to some of the more, let's say, higher risk activities that you complete on a day-to-day basis. There's different ways that we assess these hazards, right? And one of them can be comparing against the potential laws, standards, and guidelines that would apply to the workplace. Some workplaces have a formalized risk assessment process, which is a great practice. But at the end of the day, it's important that obviously where there's legal requirements, we need to make sure that we are complying. And we can't risk assess ourselves out of a legal requirement, to be clear on that. But having said that, in terms of understanding what your risks are it's important that as an employer, we are reviewing these and ensuring that it's at a level that we deem also acceptable. Okay? Now, getting into the agriculture legislation. Many of us are probably aware the agriculture legislation is not very big. So in general, hazards not covered by the agriculture reg are generally addressed through the application of the general duty clause within the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Now, on this note, there's a ton of legislation that may apply to farming operations. Having said that, if you have questions on this, we have a number of consultants, such as Kristen, such as Jay on the line, that can help navigate if you have questions on maybe which regulations may apply based on your operations, your farm operation setup and the work that you do. However, I have bolded the Regulation 851 industrial establishments. Again, this probably may or may not apply to many of you. However, there's some decent and some good precedent and some information within these regulations that we can discuss, right? As it relates to preventing struck by hazards. Okay? So the first slide we're going through specifically section 24 through 27. This is the machine guarding section of Regulation 851. And some of the core concepts that it talks about is that if a part is moving that may injure a worker, having guarding in place to prevent that access, right? Also, in situations where there's in-running nip hazards, think about conveyor belts, those types of things, having guards in place to prevent access to those pinch points. Then finally, in situations where a machine has byproducts, waste, materials that would endanger a worker, to have guarding in place to protect the worker. Okay? In terms of the conveyor information within the Regulation 851, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this, but the core concepts are, again, if the conveyors are long in nature, right, where an individual will not be at the startup point, that it's guarded with an automatic startup warning device to warn workers that the conveyor is going to be started up, and then having guarding in place beneath conveyors to protect falling materials, or falling parts of that conveyor system. A couple other sections to get into here as part of 851 is barriers, warning signs, and other safeguards for protection of workers and areas shall be used where vehicle or pedestrian traffic may endanger the safety of the worker. The core concept here is where we have a pedestrian that may cross paths with a vehicle traffic that would cause a hazard, is to consider what barriers, what safeguardings, what warnings can we put in place to protect workers when these situations come up. Okay? The last couple points here that I do want to cover under transporting materials is that it's really the main one, the main last two that I think about is work with a competent person to signal or direct operator if line of sight or vision is unclear. It can be very common, right? I know personally I'll use this as an example. In my neck of the woods, many of my farming friends have farms where they have to cross the 401, right? In terms of an overpass. And when you have large equipment, that can create some potential head-on collision hazards. So generally, what a good practice is, what they do is, one, they'll try to pick overpasses that maybe aren't as busy, being number one. But two, I've also seen farmers go to the extent of having an additional person with their four-ways on that will drive ahead of the tractor to get to the top of the overpass so that they can see. And then at that point, they'll wave the individual on when it's safe. Okay? And then making sure that there's not that risk of a head-on collision. But this is definitely something that can be a common hazard, especially in the busier seasons. Right? The last point, we briefly already talked about this. However, there is a piece of legislation within 851 that talks about all unattended vehicles should be immobilized and secured against accidental movement. So I used the example of wagons earlier on, but this could be things such as if you are, let's say, a greenhouse operation that has, transports coming in and out of the workplace, right, that we prevent that transport from taking off during the loading and unloading procedures. Using that as an example, because I will tell you personally, especially in the industrial program, I've definitely seen this as a hazard where it has caused, there's been many of incidences across the province where individuals struck by transports in the parking lot or even forklifts falling off loading docks. Okay, so it's definitely something for you to kind of take a step back and think about what are some of the additional controls we can put into place. We'll talk about that when we get to that section. In a moment here, though, we are going to launch a poll that talks about hazards in the workplace not covered by sector-specific regulation are addressed through the application of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Which one is the general duty clause? Is it A, 25.2H, B, 25.1B, or C, 25.2B? So in a moment, the poll will launch. And again, once you submit your answer, we will, I'll ask you just to close the poll and we will take it up and move forward. One response so far. 3, awesome. Perfect, getting lots of responses now. Thank you, everyone. Give another moment or so. Give everyone the opportunity to participate. Okay, so with 71% of the vote, you are correct. It is 25.2H. Now, one item we have not covered in terms of some additional legislation that may apply is the Highway Traffic Act, right? And this is something that we should be aware of on the farms as well, as many of us are using these vehicles on roadways, public roadways. So it's important that we understand some of the additional responsibilities and legal requirements under this piece of legislation. So under Section 74, all vehicles' windows need to be in a condition that allows the driver a clear view of the side, front, and rear of the vehicle. Okay? So on this note, right, this morning I got up, left the house about 5:15. I had frost, right? So I needed to, by law, ensure that my front window was clear, right? Started my car, used a scraper, right? To ensure that the windows were clear prior to operating my vehicle. What's common what I see, especially, during situations where there's frost or ice on windows, is people putting a little scraping just enough so they can see. Technically speaking, that is against the Highway Traffic Act, Section 74. Now, in terms of slow-moving vehicles, okay, no person shall operate a slow-moving vehicle no faster than 40 kilometers an hour on a highway unless a slow-moving vehicle is attached and a sign is attached to the most rearmost part of the slow-moving vehicle. So the example that I used earlier with my farming friend where they had the tank of anhydrous, when the accident happened, the one thing that the officer was looking for is that he did have a slow-moving vehicle sign at the end of for his anhydrous tank, sorry. And, there's other precautions to use as well, such as the four-ways, right? The last point here is just in and around handheld devices prohibited. So again, no person shall operate a motor vehicle. So using your phones, right? During operation. There is an exemption, obviously, in terms of the GPS side, but nonetheless, using your phones while operating a tractor is against the Highway Traffic Act. It's considered a vehicle on the road, right? We need to make sure that we're following. So we spent a little bit of time going through how to assess in some of the legislation, right? The other piece, like I mentioned earlier, you have a risk assessment tool. You can also use that as well. If you don't have a risk assessment tool, we also have a free one on our website. WSIB also has the hazard management tool that we often use as part of our core training here at WSPS. But nonetheless, after we've identified and assessed the hazard, the next thing that we do is we implement a control, right? Or a series of controls. A control is, by definition, is how we're going to eliminate or minimize that hazard. Now, as a key point, we've talked about this, is that there might be legislative controls that are required. We've talked about some of the ones that may apply if Regulation 851 applies to workplace, or we talked about things specific to the Highway Traffic Act. But at its core, really what we want to look at is when we're evaluating, looking at the different types of controls, it must adequately control the hazards, it must protect workers who are likely exposed, and the goal is not to create any new hazards, right? The number one rule of safety, don't create more problems than you're trying to solve, right? So in terms of controls, a core concept, if you've ever taken any of our courses, and something that the Ministry of Labor is very, 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 I would say they constantly are educating and using the philosophy of what's called the hierarchy of controls, okay? What we're talking about in terms of hierarchy of controls is the different levels of controls and as they relate to the effectiveness. So, as you can see on the slide here, on the left-hand side, we do have a snippet of the hierarchy of controls. And what the thought process is when we come across a hazard, we start at the top of the hierarchy of controls and we evaluate, okay, can we eliminate the hazard? We can't eliminate, so we go to the next. And we substitute, engineering, so on and so forth, right? The reason why this is such a core concept is when we talk about the different levels of controls, as safety professionals, we like to draw a line between the elimination, or between engineering and awareness. And you can see how these ones are primarily in green. Now, that's not to say these bottom three are not effective, because they are, right? Use the example in terms of awareness controls, right? All of us, or most of us, hopefully have a smoke detector, fire alarm system within the different operations within your workplace. Those are known to save lives. Okay? But when we compare it against things such as engineering controls, right? At this point, this is where we're relying on the worker to hear it and make the right decision versus an engineering control where we're physically separating a worker from that hazard, right? Think about in terms of maybe for struck by, right? Thinking about things such as designated drive aisles or using bollards or physical guarding to protect that worker in sensitive areas. How we're not relying on the worker making the right decision because there's that guarding in place, right? Nonetheless, I do think they're all important. Okay, so just to kind of go through this from a high level, first step, we try to eliminate. Okay, so can we eliminate the hazards? Well, that's not always feasible, right? So for example, most of us are probably still having to operate tractors to be able to complete the task. So we move to the next one. So for example, a good example of substitution that we generally like to use is things such as switching out chemical products, right, to a less hazardous product. Good example of this personally that I've seen very common right now is a lot of workplaces across the province are switching from flammable parts washer machines to water-based. Why? Because we're swapping out the hazards, right? In terms of, especially in welding operations, having a flammable product such as Varso close to a welding operation, that might create a hazard. So I've seen a lot of workers go and workplaces switch to water-based systems. Okay? Now, we say it's substitution because the water-based parts washer machine does require some additional, has its own hazards and some additional controls, such as having a pump to make sure that mold doesn't develop. But nonetheless, we've substituted the hazard with a less hazardous hazard. Okay? In terms of engineering, I briefly discussed this. We're going to go through some great engineering examples as it relates to struck by hazards here in a few slides. But nonetheless, the concept is we're isolating or separating the worker from that hazard. Okay? Awareness are controls that make workers aware of hazards in the workplace. Okay? So again, I used the example of a smoke detector earlier. Maybe on the farm, you've equipped some of the vehicles with backup buzzers when your vehicles go in reverse. That's an example of an awareness control. In terms of administrative controls, that's getting into the instructions we give to workers on how to work safely, right? So whether that's safe operating procedures, standard work instructions for the worker to complete their task, and then finally PPE. Whether classic examples, maybe many of you require things such as cut resistance gloves when completing certain tasks on the farm, cut resistant sleeves, those types of things. Okay? Gloves, hearing protection. Okay? Now, in terms of a hierarchy of controls, that's one concept. But one thing we also like to talk about is the location of these controls. Okay? So generally speaking, controls at the source generally are the most effective, and as we work our way this way towards the worker, they become not as effective, but they still serve their purpose, right? So again, a classic example we like to use in terms of the of location of controls is, again, let's say we have a chemical in the workplace that you're utilizing. So at the source, an example would be substituting. Along the path would be installing ventilation systems within your farm operations. And then an example of a control at the worker would be wearing a respirator to protect the worker, right? Nonetheless, when the primary goal of this section of the conversation is for you to take a step back when you have a hazard in your workplace, think about the hierarchy of controls, and think about your options for controlling that hazard in the workplace. Okay? So we're just going to use the chat question here, so you can just use the meeting chat to submit the answer here. With respect to the hierarchy of control, what is the most effective type of control? Perfect. Get an elimination coming up. Awesome. You guys all got it. So we've spent some time now in terms of controlling the hazards on the general theory behind it, but let's actually dive in specifically to some hazard controls specific to struck by hazards. Okay? So first, focusing on the elimination, substitution, engineering. First things first, consider your workplace design, right? A lot of times this is one thing that kind of gets missed, is kind of taking a step back, is that your design of your workplace, your process flows, your drive aisles, what our expectations are in terms of what our current practice is to complete a task, a lot of times will and can create hazards in the workplace. So what do I mean by workplace design? Looking at your aisle width. Okay. If it's an indoor environment, is lighting okay? One of the biggest concepts that when we talked about Section 20 of Regulation 851 that talked about the bearers warning signs specific between a pedestrian and mobile equipment is this idea of separation of mobile equipment from pedestrians. Do we need to have them in the same area? Now, sometimes you have to, right? But there can be situations where in the workplace, I know this is a general, very traditional, like industrial establishment. For the greenhouse operations that present on the call, maybe in indoor operations, you can help identify these. But nonetheless, separating these mobile equipment from your pedestrians can be very vital. Okay. Now, the other side of this too, we're going to talk about it a little bit more when we get to the awareness side, in terms of pedestrian, like the width of your aisles and whatnot, and as part of your workplace design is think about where we're parking vehicles on your farm, right? I'll say this as an example. Last week, I was at my buddy's house, his farm, and basically where you kind of drive in, they had parked some equipment where I would be driving into the farm, right? What does that do as me as the driver now? Well, what I do is I get into the wider part of the lane, or the other side of the lane, which could potentially cause blind spots, struck by hazards, or a collision from oncoming individuals or mobile equipment. So a good idea is that generally we see, specifically on some farm applications across the province, whether that's indoors or outdoors, are having predetermined staging areas so that you can keep your drive aisles clear, right? That way you don't have these situations where people are driving onto oncoming traffic, for an example. Okay? Appropriate selection of lifting devices, right? Many of us maybe have skid steers, maybe you have forklifts, even, for example, within your workplace. A very common thing that I've seen is that conditions in the workplace might have changed, but then our equipment now might not be adequate for that task. So for example, I've seen situations, I'd be lying to you to say what hasn't happened on farms, where farmer now has had a new, whether it was a container that came in, a tote, right, where it was longer than their forks should be allowing, right, in terms of the CSA standard that we talk about. Generally, a good practice is to have 2/3 of your fork underneath the load, right? But nonetheless, a bigger dunnage came in and now their forks aren't long enough, right? So it's also looking at your equipment, also thinking about capacity, right? Am I going to be handling stuff that's going to be heavier now, right? We have to make sure we're lifting equipment or using equipment to lift and handle materials that has the appropriate capacity, okay? I've already talked about an example of the fixed pedestrian guarding. So again, this is a good example of an engineering control separating the worker, right? I've also seen on farms very common, right? Especially more and more of my buddies that are putting up barns right now, a lot of them are putting bollards specifically in areas, whether it's in front of their bay doors, but also areas where in front of the walking door to get into the barn to help protect and prevent mobile equipment from driving in the immediate door walkway. Okay? Definitely something to think about. Okay? Now, the last point here that just want to spend a moment on is ensuring that when we're storing materials in the workplace, that whether it's on a racking system, on a pallet, what have you, that they are secure, that the material is secured against accidental falling, right? Or striking a worker during the process of storing it or removing it from your racking system or within the barn, right? I would say this is definitely something we go into workplaces all the time. It is something that materials get put on pallets. They're not shrink wrapped. They're not strapped, what have you. There's not one way to do it. Again, there's different ways to complete this. However, it can create a hazard during that movement of that material in the workplace, right? And cause a struck by hazard. Now, in terms of machine guarding, okay, many of us may have equipment that presents struck by hazards, okay? Now, in terms of a core concept in the machine safety world that we talk about, for identifying when a safeguard should be present on a machine, we talk about the concept of MAC, meaning it's really 3 questions we ask ourselves. Can it move? Can I access it? Can it hurt me? And the C for the last one is consequence. If you answer yes to those 3 things, then generally speaking, a machine safeguard should be put in place to prevent whether it's access to that consequence or what have you. Another common thing that we talk about is the adequacy of the guard. Okay, so if you come across a situation in the workplace and you're looking at whether it's large conveyor system, whether it's you're looking at some of the different automation that we're currently seeing, and specifically in pack houses or greenhouse operations, when we're taking a step back to think about if that guard is adequate, an acronym that we use in the machine safety world is AUTO. So think, can I reach under or around, under, through, or over that guard to reach the point of operation or that hazard within that hazard zone area? If we answer yes to any of these, well, maybe we should consider adding some additional guard or guarding to that safeguarding device, okay? Or fixed guarding, for example. I'm not going to spend a lot of time specifically on this slide. A lot of this is it might not apply to most farms, but there are a ton of technology when it comes to different types of engineering type of safeguarding devices, right? And a question we get all the time is like, Josh, like what type should I look at? Should I be looking at things such as light curtains or air scanners or interlocks, right? Which one's the best? Which one should I cover? It's really a depends situation, right? There's different types of safeguarding devices that they all serve their purposes. They all have their own advantages or disadvantages. The biggest thing is we have to take a step back and understand our application and understand what the hazards are specific to the task, and that's what will drive which appropriate safeguarding device would be good for the situation. An example I'll use is, it wasn't that long ago where a friend had decided to put in an interlock switch as part of their dairy barn, as part of their they had a robotic milking system that they put in a interlock door in terms of within a specific safeguarded area. Now, part of that was it ended up failing the interlock switch because the acidity from the milk actually destroyed the interlock switch. And it wasn't necessarily that the interlock wasn't a good safeguarding device in the application they're using. It was just the type of interlock switch that they used. Okay, they didn't use one that considered that environmental condition that would be protected against the acidity of the milk. So that's why, kind of taking a step back, it's important that we think about the type of interlock switch or the type of device that we're using and how the environmental factors may play a factor in the effectiveness of that engineering control. Now, one item that I will say that really to consider, especially around livestock, are things such as livestock handling facilities, whether that's barriers, chutes, okay, gates, those types of things. I'll tell you what, I spent a number of summers with a local farmer, one of my best friends who has pigs. So I know for me personally, using boards and whatnot to help move the animals around, to help with some of the administering of the medicine, the needles in that situation, or using these types of technology in terms of managing livestock can be very important for your protection, right? Moving forward now, okay, we're going to get into awareness, administrative, and PPE, okay? So some classic examples for you to consider across your workplace. Mobile equipment awareness lights, right? Very common in the industrial sector right now. We're seeing individuals adding lights in terms of on the front of the lift truck, right? Also, in terms of things such as awareness lights, such as blue lights to indicate, to help, I guess, make the lift truck more visible, right? You wouldn't believe how many times I've been in workplaces where I've been standing looking in one direction and I've seen a blue light come around, and that's made me aware, okay, there's a lift truck coming, before I could hear it, before I could notice it coming. Because especially with electric lift trucks these days, you can't hear them, right? And they're very difficult to hear. Using slow-moving vehicle signs. We talked about the legislation, right, that applies to the Highway Traffic Act. Ensure that we are complying with that is very important. Traffic control lights, right? For me, again, traffic control lights are very important as it relates to ensuring that you establish right of passage in situations such as where there's going to be a mobile equipment and a pedestrian walking in the same area. So we talked about some of these concepts as well, as terms of if there's opportunities for indoor environments as it relates to floor markings and signage, okay? Signage also around the farm can also be important to help establish drive aisles, situations where, your transport would be coming in and out of the workplace, those types of things. We've talked about keeping aisles free of obstructions. I'll say the second last point. In lockout tagout, we've did a number of work across the different sectors in the province, and lockout tagout procedures still are a common thread as it relates to injuries occurring across the province as it relates to servicing and maintenance. Okay? So again, having the lockout tagout procedures in place, ensuring that when maintenance and servicing is getting complete on equipment, that it is secured, locked out in a safe manner to prevent inadvertent accidental startup of that equipment, can be vital for the protection of that operator, right? Again, I told the story at the beginning of this session going through where lockout tagout specifically could have definitely prevented a very serious incident, okay? Standard operating procedures are also very important. Now, I know definitely what we talked about, what's reasonable across the different industries, different sectors, might be a little bit different, but we know as part of the Occupational Health and Safety Act that it is an employer responsibility to give instruction and competent supervision to a worker for their safety, right? So think about that as it relates to the activities occurring on your farm, okay? Getting into a few more slides here as it relates to awareness and PPE. So Positive truck control measures. So again, we introduced this concept earlier on in the presentation, talking about how do we secure vehicles to ensure that they're immobilized against accidental movement, whether that's chalking, whether that's procedures for having the individual turn off the vehicle, right, lower their forks, for an example, and having them stand in a designated location during the loading and unloading procedures that happen in the workplace. Also thinking about individuals that may be close by, right? Have it as part of your SOP. So ensuring that people aren't walking in and out of the situations where, again, whether you're using a forklift or using a tractor to load different wagons, that they're not going to be struck by the materials being loaded, okay, or the mobile equipment. Preventative maintenance is very important in the workplace, right? When we think about all your equipment, do we have a process in place to ensure that we are maintaining the equipment in good working condition? Okay. Now, as part of preventative maintenance program, I've seen workplaces go to the extent of having individuals complete things such as a pre-use inspection to validate that the equipment is in good working condition prior to operation. What the advantage of this is it allows the individual to take a step back, ensure that the equipment is safe, but it also is that constant feedback that there isn't any issues, and that when it does come up, the employer is aware so they get the situation rectified. Okay? Now, a lot of equipment that you might have on the farm may not come with mirrors, or maybe it was an option. Mirrors are a great option in terms of as a visual tool to help identify, people, pedestrians, other equipment, other individuals on the road, right? There's also, in terms of mirrors for indoor environments, you can consider putting in things such as dome mirrors to help allow for visual around blind spots, right? Okay? Worker training is very important. And also things such as PPE, such as vests, to make individuals aware that these are individuals who are going to be walking where they're in close contact with mobile equipment or materials that may be harmful. Okay? So we spent quite a bit of time here going through some different types of controls. And as you can see, there's a number of different options that we can consider based on the application of your farm operation. A core concept is that we talked about at the beginning of this race process is taking a step back to evaluate the effectiveness of these controls. Okay? How likely is that is that control going to protect against the hazard? What is the risk level now that we've implemented? Okay? And ensuring that it didn't create any new hazards. Okay? Now, sometimes this can be difficult, and there's some things in terms of foreseeable, additional hazards after implementation. But that's where getting, whether your workplace is large enough to have a joint health and safety committee or even worker feedback on the effectiveness of that control. Okay? The key point really, though, is this is really taking a step back to evaluate that the controls are actually serving their intended purpose. Okay? There's been a number of times where I've seen workplaces implement things, not do that evaluation, and the control doesn't actually ever get used or it gets removed because it's actually creating more problems, right? So it is a very important step. I do encourage everyone to consider having this process in place, getting worker feedback to ensure that, the controls are doing its intended purpose. We do have another poll. So identifying workplace conditions, practices, or substances that have the potential to injure or cause illness is called hazard recognition, hazard assessment, hazard evaluation. Identifying workplace conditions, practices have the potential to cause injury. What is that? Getting some answers right now. Awesome. I thank everyone that are actively participating. This one is coming across as a no-doubter with 100% saying hazard recognition. Great job, everyone. Okay? So, getting into the other considerations before we get into the last module you're going through, just some brief session wrap up and resource and giving you opportunity for some questions is think about effective worker training and supervision. Okay? So when we talk about this, it's like, I'll use this as an example. Many of us may use things such as temporary foreign workers in the workplace. Well, if all of our training is in English, how effective is that for the worker, right? Or a big concept that I came across many times in my career is when we had a situation in the workplace where maybe a worker was unfortunately injured and the Ministry of Labor was actively completing an investigation. Common question that we got asked was, okay, I don't only want to see that workers training, but can you show me the supervisors also been trained on this? Because at the end of the day, if supervisors are not what we deem as competent, right, which is covered under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, knows the laws, knows the jobs, knows the hazards, right, it's pretty hard for them to supervise a worker effectively, okay? Briefly talked about things such as language barriers, but think about that as in terms of implementing controls, training programs, and work instructions, right? We know that we should have the information in the language that the workers would be able to interpret and understand, right? We've already talked about preventative maintenance programs, but one note that we did not discuss that I want everyone to consider is following the manufacturer's recommendations, right? Usually when we buy a piece of equipment, it comes with a manual that has a lot of great recommendations on how to maintain that equipment in good working condition. In my experience, in investigations where equipment has failed, we've had to, as an employer, show, based on the manufacturer's recommendations, that we were maintaining the equipment in good working condition. Okay? Joint Health and Safety Committee involvement, or your health and safety rep, to me can also be very vital. Why? They're the individuals that are working with the equipment, right? They're the individuals that are constantly engaging in these practices that may have struck by hazards present. So they generally have a great understanding of what goes on and obviously what may or may not work in terms of implementing controls, okay? The last point that is very important is considering integrating, whether it's you're struck by hazards, your expectations in the workplace in terms that relates to safety, to when contractors are on site, right? Explaining to contractors or making it clear like, oh, you're on site, this is the drive aisle, this is where you're going, this is where the hazards are. It can be very vital to prevent an inadvertent situation from individuals coming on and off your farm. Okay? So with that, we're going to get into the last couple slides here. We don't have too much to get through here. This is going through session wrap-up, resources, and questions. Okay? So what we did here is there is a QR code if you're interested in our agriculture or horticulture safety center page. Okay, you can use your phones to scan that, as well as some great information that we have here for agriculture, horticulture, health and safety center. We got some individual for multilingual workers resources, as well as a link here for our health and safety orientation handbook generator. Okay, one thing that I am very sensitive to right now is obviously our geographic, political environment right now and the threats of the tariffs. And one thing that, I know I'm seeing across my socials right now, we want to make sure that we are clear is that we are here to help you. We have a ton of free resources, a ton of free information on our website. I'm sure some of you probably have maybe even seen some of the our social media posts in respect to this, but nonetheless, we are here to help support you. We have a bunch of free resources to help, especially in these troubling times right now with the threats of some of these tariffs and how that's impacting our businesses across the province right now. Okay, so I'll leave this on for a couple more moments. There's things such as safety talks in the landscaping industry. There's some great information as it relates to our greenhouse growers as well. Please take a look at our website. If you have questions, please reach out to us at WSPS and we'll definitely help you any way that we can. Okay? Now, the other great resource I just wanted to drive everyone's attention to is this MTO Farm Guide. Okay? Great tool that talks about farm equipment on Ontario's highways. Kristen, Jay, I know this is something that they are very much like to share with our customer base, our different firms across the province, our different employers. That does provide some additional context and indicates the rules that do or do not apply to farm operations. Right? There's a ton of information and perceived gray zones that this document does help clarify. Okay. So with that, I do see it's 11:43. We are through in terms of the content wise. Would like to open it up to any questions. Please submit them to the meeting chat. We'll give it a few moments here. We got lots of time to answer any questions. While people are pausing while we look at questions, again, just want to draw everyone's attention. We do have another, as I mentioned earlier on, another safety connection coming up as it relates to slip, trips, and falls in the agriculture sector. Please take a look at our safety connection website. On that note, Kristen, is there anything else you want to add?
Great job, Josh. I do not see any questions within the chat at this point. I will comment back on the resource shared right at the end, the farm guide. For those who do have equipment on the roadway, of course, the content is specifically relevant. There are great practices within this guide that we could apply on our farm property as well. So please do take a look. One of the most interesting and recent points that have come up with progress in technology are requirements related to high-speed units. So even though the tractor may be able to achieve 70 kilometers an hour, the restrictions that are in place because it is considered to be a farm vehicle. So some of those nuances that apply specifically to this sector, whether on property as best practices or on road as requirements. And yes, thank you once more. The note, which is in the chat as well, the next safety connection specific for the agricultural sector on preventing slips, trips, and falls, one of our most common causes of injuries in any type of workplace, but that includes our agricultural sector. So I thank you, Josh, for the presentation. I thank you, our participants, for attending this session. And if questions do arise, we'll pop to the last slide or so that provides some of that general contact information for you. Engage related to resources, specific services, or if a question related to this session comes up thereafter, opportunity through our toll-free number, as well as our website with a direct contact form. And Donna, I see your hand is raised. Unfortunately, we cannot unmute, but I welcome you to drop in the chat if there is a comment or question. We are happy to attend to that now. And if it happens to be a wave goodbye, that's reasonable too. All right, with that, we will call it a wave goodbye. Thank you so much once again to Josh, Jay, Simona, and all of our participants. This is such an important topic, and we appreciate your commitment to our discussion. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.